Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to this Agile Business Webcast Series broadcast utilizing release automation to support IT governance and compliance. This webcast is brought to you by CMC Media and is sponsored by Nolio. I'm Francesca Mathieu, and I'll be your moderator today for this webcast. In a few moments, Bob Aiello and Leslie Sachs will join us to discuss release automation in IT governance and compliance. But first, a few housekeeping details. Our live cast environment is intended to be completely interactive, so you will have the ability to post your questions at any time during the broadcast or chat with other attendees about the session. We will address audience questions at the conclusion of the webcast during the Q&A period. If we are unable to get to all of your questions during the presentation, someone will follow up via email. To ask a question, simply use the live chat window located to the right of this screen under the tab Chat. You can also undock the chat box from the screen using the pop-out button at the bottom right corner of the chat box. That way it won't get hidden behind the slides. If you would like to share your thoughts about today's presentation, please use the Facebook tab located to the right of this screen. Log into your account and you will have the ability to share your experience with your friends. You can also share your experience through Twitter. Click on the Twitter tab to the right of the screen and join the conversation. Your tweets will show up in the Twitter roll to the right. Make sure to use the hashtag #AgileLC. If you would like a copy of the presentation materials for today's session, you will find a button to download a copy of today's presentation and other files under the Links tab at the right of the webcast window. A recording of the entire live broadcast, including Q&A, will be available in about 24 hours at this same location, so you can come back again or recommend it to a friend. And finally, if you ever need to get a closer look at any of the slides during the presentation, just hover your mouse over the video player and click the full button to expand to full screen. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers joining us today. First, Bob Aiello. Bob Aiello is a consultant, editor-in-chief of CM Crossroads, and the author of CM Best Practices, Practical Methods That Work in the Real World. Mr. Aiello has over 25 years' experience as a technical manager in several top New York City financial services firms where he had a company-wide responsibility for CM, often providing hands-on technical support for enterprise source code management tools, SOX, COVID compliance, build engineering, continuous integration, and automated application deployment. Second, Leslie Sachs. Leslie Sachs is a New York State certified school psychologist and COO of Yellow Spider Incorporated. Leslie is the co-author of CM Best Practices, Practical Methods That Work in the Real World. Ms. Sachs has over 20 years of experience in the psychology field and has worked in a variety of clinical and business settings where she has provided many effective interventions designed to improve the social and educational functioning of both individuals and groups. And with that introduction, I'd like to pass the mic to our speakers. The floor is all yours, Bob and Leslie.
All right, thank you, Francesca, and together with Leslie, we're thrilled to be here talking to you today about utilizing release automation to support IT governance and compliance. And I think we'll go to the first slide. This webinar, we're going to establish release and deployment best practices, assess and manage deployment-related risk, and the third thing we're going to try to do is implement a robust deployment framework, or at least tell you how to do it, and we're going to have a real strong focus on IT governance and compliance. So those are the three goals that we have: to establish those release and deployment best practices, assess and manage risk, and then look at things from a wide deployment framework point of view. So the first thing we got to do is understand what IT governance and compliance are all about. The whole point of IT governance is to provide transparency to senior management to help them make the right decisions. It's very important and enables the organization to establish essential IT controls to protect the assets of the firm. And by IT controls, we're talking about putting up those guardrails to make it much harder to make a mistake and help you be successful. We also want to identify and mitigate risk. Risk is not a bad thing. Very often risks come hand in hand with high profitability. So we're certainly not going to say that we want to be risk aversive. We want to identify those risks, though. We want to mitigate them. And in many organizations, you really have to comply with regulatory requirements. If you're in a banking situation or any other financial services firms, even many hedge funds and many different environments, you have important regulatory requirements that can really put you in a position where you can actually be shut down if you don't comply with those rules. And most importantly, we don't want to slow things down. We want to actually enable rapid iterative development, and we want to make sure that we can improve our productivity and quality. Leslie, you got something to add there?
Well, just to highlight the fact that when you talk about transparency, we should be aware that people do have sometimes a natural tendency to not always want to be so transparent. And believe it or not, even this day of Facebook where everybody's putting certain things out there, when it comes to a work situation, there is often a tendency to hold back, particularly because there's another personality factor which comes in, which is that most people, as much as they like credit for what they've done, they're more motivated to avoid being held accountable for a mistake. So there's double-edged sword here that you need to both create a climate in the organization where people are encouraged to be transparent for the sake of productivity amongst everybody, and also to realize that that accountability is important for compliance.
Okay, those are all good points. And
Back
of course,
to you, Bob.
Leslie's column on personality matters. Thank you, Leslie. Leslie's column on personality matters covers many of these issues in detail. So you can read that on CM Crossroads. So part of providing transparency, decisions need to be made based upon accurate information. So let's answer the sorts of questions that come up, which is what information is needed, how is the information provided, how do we identify and manage assets. Those are the things that we've built, and they're now important to the company, but whether it be a payroll system or a trading system, we need to understand our assets and what change might impact those assets, particularly when we're doing release and deploy. We have to know how many releases we're going to put out there and how do we allocate our resources, and can I meet my business goals. You know, I often see that there's an interesting dynamic that goes on, which is many of the people in the trenches say, hey, management makes decisions. They don't understand what's going on in my life. They don't understand the impact of their decisions. And at the same time, we sometimes fail to realize how important it is to provide the transparency so senior management can have the information that they need to make those decisions. Now, all of this is really essential in an environment where we have to comply with audit requirements and IT governance. And audit often uncovers material weaknesses in existing controls. The auditors come in, they identify risks. The most important thing though is we have to make sure that what the auditors are finding and what they're reporting on is relevant. And as somebody that's kind of been in the trenches in this area for a very, very long time, I often spend a fair amount of time with auditors talking to them about what is really important to find in an audit and what is kind of superficial and perhaps not the most important thing and perhaps not very relevant. You know, a simple example is an organization needs to be able to tell you exactly what version of their code is running in production at any particular time. They need to be able to find the source code and rebuild any release at any particular time. And having these sort of abilities and controls are all a part of having an effective and comprehensive deployment framework. So most of all, you want to make sure that this is more than just a rubber stamp. And essentially, audit is your verification and validation for your IT controls. And it's kind of testing your controls and making sure that they do what they need to do. Now, ISACA is one of the organizations that is out there doing great work on explaining how to really implement IT governance. IT governance is essentially two things, and this is from their materials. IT's delivery of value to the business and mitigation of IT risks. So the first of these is driven by strategic alignment of IT with the business. That means that you set up your IT environment, your technology services, in a way that is consistent with the businesses that you have to support. So for example, if your business is in the business of providing financial services, well, maybe you want to outsource the things that are not really the most important to your organization, but hold close to the chest the essential competencies that can make you a success. The second is driven by embedding accountability into the enterprise. So you want to make sure that everybody understands what their role is, what their part is in being part of the solution. And of course, we want to identify the challenges and the kind of concerns that IT governance needs to address. So this is from the IT Governance Institute. It's another one of my favorite resources, and I encourage everybody who's out there, if you think there's an organization or a resource that I should highlight in these presentations, feel free to contact me offline. We'll provide you that information in a few minutes. But IT Governance Institute is one of the best places to get the real good material on how to implement these practices. So you want to consider aligning IT strategy with your business. We talked about that. Cascading strategy and goals down into the enterprise. You want that consistency throughout the whole organization. And the structures of the organization, who reports to who. Your testers can't report to the same guy who is responsible for getting the development out the door and on time, because sometimes there's a conflict of interest. And you have to insist that there's an IT control framework. The one that is most commonly used, of course, in the industry is the ISACA COBIT framework, and that's one of the ones that I've been very involved with. And ITIL is, of course, used a great deal in the service management world. And it very much helps you with measuring IT's performance. And of course, you can't improve your practices unless you can measure them. Now, these things are not arbitrary. In many cases, you have to comply with specific regulatory requirements. One of the most common is Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, commonly called SOX. And the way that you do that is by following the model, which is the COBIT model from ISACA, and that was derived from the work that was done by an organization known as COSO. In the healthcare arena, we have HIPAA and CFR 21. If you've got credit cards, and typically you worry about PCI, a lot of times contractually there are requirements for SAS 70 or CMMI level 2, 3. And what that means is many government agencies will require that their contractors have all the competencies in level 2 and a select number from level 3, and they commonly refer to that as levels 2/3. Another example is implementing a quality management system, and we could have a whole webinar just on that, and that's ISO 9001:2008. So establishing these IT controls protect the assets of the firm. It helps you establish the best practices to prevent mistakes. And that's something I really want to focus on. This should not just be about passing an audit. It shouldn't just be a matter of we're going to, have these practices on a Tuesday, get an audit on Wednesday, and thank God we go back to the way things were on Friday. One of the things we got to make sure we do is include a separation of duties, just as a very practical example. So, for example, if I am the developer, someone else should rebuild my code, and their version is the version we should be promoting and deploying so that we're sure that the build is repeatable, that it's traceable, and that it can be handled by somebody else if we have to make any changes in the future. Separation of duties is one of the key aspects in these controls. That's where you have an independent build, package, and release using a specific build engineer. And one of the goals is to keep the developers out of production. Now, why is that? It's not that we don't like the developers. They do fantastic things for us, but we want to make sure that they can't accidentally make mistakes that would bring down production. More importantly, we want the transparency that everybody knows how to support the application. Now, in a lot of places where I've worked, my entry into the organization meant the developers lost their ability to go into production. So sometimes they were a little resentful. They were used to being able to do a deploy, and if they made some mistakes, fixing them real quick before nobody noticed. So one of our goals is to keep developers out of production so we can have a repeatable process. Now, sometimes you can just use a different computer account, and I call it a virtual build engineer. And most importantly, you've got to have the right practices in place. A good example is the configuration audit, where at a physical and a functional level, you make sure that you can identify the exact version of the code and that it is performing its needed function in the right way. So we trust, but we always verify. So risk, and Leslie, I'm going to ask you to give some input on this in just a moment. Risk is always something that is hard to get our arms around. We all like to kind of avoid thinking about risks. Risks are related to human error. An example of a common risk is critical man risk, which Leslie will explain. And having a lack of traceability and repeatability are the kind of mistakes we often see. So Leslie, you want to add to that?
Well, the critical man factor relates to the issue of a person who is the linchpin, and oftentimes, at the one hand, it's nice to be the only person, but people get nervous that someone's going to step on their toes and take that away from them. In a work setting, oftentimes it's preferable, or people feel that it's preferable, to be that independent person, and they're reluctant to train somebody else in what they're doing because they feel that that's their security.
Yeah, I mean, I love it when I'm the only guy who could do something. I feel needed. I feel important. I love this stuff, and it makes me feel good.
But
that
it's not
isn't
so
fair
good for
to
the organization.
That's right. You're right on, Leslie. That's the point. So assessing risks, there's many unknowns. We don't know what's going to happen when we walk across the street tomorrow. Complexity is something else we're going to talk about. It can't always be tamed, and you have to mitigate the risk by automating what you can and also having a plan B. And most of all, release planning is essential. Leslie, what do you think about that?
I think you're right on target. You can go more into that.
So complexity is one of the things we want to go into a little bit. Yep, I'm here. And complexity is one of the things that we want to go into more, which is how do we manage the complexity. So the whole goal here is to enable rapid iterative development. You want to make sure that you can do things faster, that development is supported by effective IT controls, and that you've got practices in place such as either Agile Scrum or an iterative waterfall. So this isn't just about slowing things down. It's really about how do we manage risk, get our arms around the complex issues, and actually be able to go a lot faster. Most of all, we want to be able to improve our productivity and quality, develop our code faster, and prevent defects. And what I always tell people is the right practices in place actually helps your developers fly. So we're going to do kind of a paradigm shift here. Now, we want to improve our productivity, so the only way you can improve things is if you got some measurement to be able to judge against. So some of the measures, and I pulled this right off of our sponsor, Nolio, we should certainly thank. They had some great metrics on their website, so I decided to grab them and use them for today's presentation. The number of major releases you've gotten out the door, the duration of the rollouts, the number of the release backouts. So things went wrong, you had to back it out, and the number of bad things that happened by a new release, and also the punctuality, which you were able to get the release done when you planned on, and the amount of work it took, and of course the proportion of automatic release distribution, which means the number of releases you were able to do without having a lot of hand-holding. So all of these things are good metrics to be able to understand exactly how to make this happen. So the first thing is you want to establish release and deployment best practices. Now, I've been hinting at them throughout this whole presentation, and that's kind of the whole point of this, is giving you practical advice from our own experience at implementing this. So we're going to talk a lot about best practices. One of them I mentioned already is having the ability to have somebody else independently build your release. And assessing and managing deployment-related risks. Having an honest discussion that folks, don't feel so threatened. Leslie, I'm going to ask you to talk about this in a second, but a lot of times people feel very uncomfortable talking about risk, and so they end up just avoiding the conversation. Leslie, you want to add something to that?
Well, just that you always want to have an organizational environment where the team players realize that the sum is greater than all of its parts and that they have to work together. And if one person is monopolizing certain information or being reluctant to tell others what's really going on, then the whole process is going to suffer. And that's what a lot of this governance and compliance is about. Again, it's making things clear to everybody what's going on so that when something isn't going correctly, you can step right in there and fix it before the problem gets bigger.
And those are all good points. And you'll notice Leslie's taking a very psychologically tuned approach to this. And that's kind of our message here. Having good technology backed up by a strong approach to handling people issues will make you much more effective. But at the end of the day, the psychological issues are important, but implementing a robust deployment framework is key. And that's also what this presentation is about, because you need to be able to have release and deploy best practices that are structured in a way and handle all of the different aspects, but then kind of brought together and coordinated by one central deployment framework. So let's give some examples. In continuous integration, which is common in both agile and non-agile environments, you've got an automatic build, package, and deploy. Many organizations are getting better at designing applications for testability and deployment and making the release itself a non-event. So these are some of the best practices that you want to be thinking about as you put together your own deployment framework. One of the techniques that I always tell people to do is to use staging. Staging means that you copy the configuration items, that's all the things you've built and you're about to deploy, to the target machine, release some secure shared storage area well before the deployment window. And you want to make sure that you've got the whole deployment automated, including, and don't forget, the ability to fall back. If you've staged your code and then the operations or your deployment folks hit the button and they move things forward, if something doesn't go right, being able to fall back to the previous release significantly reduces your risk. And if you're able to confidently fall back to a previous release, makes it much easier to have a robust deployment framework. So we'll do all the hard work up front. Automate as much as you can, have a good checklist, have good controls, and most of all, make sure you get that configuration audit, which gives you the ability to know exactly what version is running in the environment after you're done. Now, it seems like everybody's using continuous integration, and it certainly is a best practice. It's a service to the developers, and you know you're being successful, and the developers really become dependent upon continuous integration. So that's a good practice, and I think a lot of people are really sold on that one. But I want to focus on this framework for understanding the knowledge management around the build, release, and deployment. And one of the things I find is there's so much complexity out there, people can't really get their arms around it. We're all so specialized. And very often the systems folks, they understand the infrastructure, but they don't really understand the application so well. So, the fact that you can have a framework to get your arm around it, to break it into pieces that are more manageable and provide a service to the developers, it's just really, really important to think about what your deployment framework is. Now, part of this is conceptual, and I'm trying to give you as many examples as I can, but part of this is also having the right tools in place, and we'll talk about that as well. So one of the critical things here is testing and QA. I can't tell you how often I found people, they do a great job putting together, all the steps, and they forget to be good testers. And Leslie, I think you can talk to this. Very often it's hard to test our own stuff. So the last step in any deploy should always be smoke testing. Go ahead, Leslie. And the last
No,
step should
I
always
was
be
just
smoke
going to
testing.
agree with you that.
All right, I think your microphone's cutting out there. So it facilitates regression, functional, and performance testing, and instrumenting the code will help you with that as well. So the key here is to use testing as a key resource and make sure that you realize the importance of including testing in your whole deployment framework. So it's not just an afterthought, it has to be an implicit part of the whole process. So we need to be able to build the application once and deploy everywhere. I've seen some organizations where they built it once for development, then they built it for QA, and they built it for production. Oh, that is awful. I mean, it's so easy to make a mistake and have a different version of the code running in production than the version that you tested in QA. And the key here is to automate and control the configuration for each of your environments, and to make sure you've got verification and validation for the environment. So that means that your verification is, did things pass your test, and validation is, did you test the right things? And don't forget, a lot of our work now is in virtualization and also in SaaS, where you're working with services that are centrally located. And I've worked with many SaaS environments, and cloud computing as well has kind of raised the bar a bit for the kind of practices that we need to deploy. And very often we're doing development on Windows, but we're deploying on Linux, and that's a very common use case. So being able to understand all of these issues with platforms and deployment can help you be a whole lot more effective. So one of the messages that I have in this presentation is, please be open to using standards and frameworks. And I'm gonna take a little snipe at some of my colleagues out there. I see a lot of people out there, smart guys, or guys and gals who think they know their stuff, but they don't ever bother to look at what it says in the industry standards and frameworks. They sort of written it off without ever reading the document. So my own group, the IEEE Working Group 828, recently updated our CM planning standard. My good friends at the EIA recently updated 649 from A to B. And ISO 1007, there's lots of good stuff going on with ISO standards being updated. And of course, the frameworks, ISACA, ITSM, and I didn't list it, but our old friend, the CMMI. So these are best practices as advocated by industry experts. And it's very, very important to make sure that you're utilizing these forms of expertise. So we want to assess and manage risks. So we need to be open and honest, identify the root causes, mitigate them, manage the process. So, for example, one form of risk is so many moving parts that it's very easy to have trouble coordinating them, or to be able to have knowledge that is highly isolated. In other words, one guy knows how to do a disk, but he doesn't know anything about the application that's running on that disk. So those are forms of risk that we have to kind of get our arms around and really understand how to handle it. So Mary and Tom Poppendiek ask a question that I think sums it all up. And that is, how long would it take your organization to deploy a change that involves just one single line of code? One line of code. If the one line of code changes and it takes you 2 days to do the deploy, something's wrong. And that is, in many organizations, that in fact is the case. So I think the folks from Lean, Mary and Tom Poppendiek, bring up a great issue. So I'm going to just spend a little bit more on risk, a little more time on risk, because that is a key part of IT governance and compliance. And the focus of this webinar, of course, is how to do this stuff at a practical level, pass your audit. And if you've got a date with an auditor and you have these risks identified, you will come away from that audit very happy, and your auditor will be very unhappy because he won't have anything to write up. So missing a single step can result in problems. I find a lot of times people don't realize the risk of missing a step. Sometimes you want to put in controls, so you can't do that. You check off each one and you have a second pair of eyes, and mistakes cause risk. So having your structure set up in such a way that it's easier to not make a mistake. I often give the example of the cockpit of an airplane is set up, it's designed to make it almost impossible to make a mistake. And that's a great thing, is you don't want pilots making mistakes. We don't do the same thing with software. We expect software people to be really smart and never make mistakes. That's completely unreasonable. So manual steps result in mistakes. Manual deploys take way too long. And if you don't have a way to back out, that is a really bad risk. So those are the kinds of things you want to identify as much as you can, mitigate those risks. Some of the other sorts of things that I find we run into is we were doing great. We had 7 developers. We had another 1 or 2 resources, and somehow or another the same team that was super makes a lot of mistakes. Often that's related to communication, but being able to scale up is just essential. So if you have problems where you can't add a couple more people to the team, then you have issues related to scalability. And you know, one of the things I always tell people is overcome that defeatist mindset. Too often people start deciding that we're just going to give up another weekend. In other words, we're going to start on Friday. We're just going to assume it's going to take us 2 days to do the release. And they have this defeatist mindset. They can't seem to get over it. So one of my messages, and I'm going to bring in a couple of colleagues in just a moment to kind of get their views on this, at least I'm going to quote them, you know, we want to make sure that we have a mindset of where we can be successful, and you know, that we can do this in a shorter period of time and manage that cognitive complexity, manage the reasons why things go wrong. And Leslie, I want you to talk a little bit about you know, cognitive complexity if you can. Let's see if your microphone's working this time.
Oh, can you hear me all? There we go. So
yep.
What is important to realize is that the cognitive human brains, although they're very talented, they do get overwhelmed, and we need to take that into consideration when we're setting up our IT processes. And even as you were talking about, the smartest guys, they can do things, and they can do things under pressure, but each time you make a strong demand on somebody's cognitive processes, you're increasing the chance that they're going to make a mistake. So the principle that we're considering here is the fact that although there is a significant amount of complexity that's always inherent to IT processing and to building and deploying, we want to try to decrease as much as possible how much is in the moment and try to automate as much as we can so that we've simplified the process at any given moment. When you teach anybody a new skill, whatever it is, you always break it down into smaller pieces because it's easier to do one at a time and focus on them in isolation. And so that's the goal here, is to break it down, to have less steps, thereby less chance of error.
All right, that's great. Now, Leslie has more examples of this in her chapter and in our book on configuration management best practices, and also in her column, Personality Matters. But the sorts of things we often run into is people not understanding the build, too many moving parts, and most of all, how do we automate something we don't fully understand? So here's some great examples of complex technologies I find often get people pretty flustered. So Tomcat and Apache, all right, that's not so bad. WebSphere can get pretty challenging. JBoss, working with database dependencies, database warehousing, and my favorite, OSGI, where you have these plug-and-play compatibilities, changed a lot of what's going on in terms of configuration management. So it's good to look at some of the things. I've given some examples here for the ITIL framework of Service Asset and Configuration Management, SACM, and the Definitive Media Library. We've got lots of materials written on how to implement this stuff at a practical level, but considering those kind of best practices is really important. So there's so much out there. We've got to organize our best practices. Parts of solutions are often automated at varying levels. So you might have a piece of it that's automated, and getting started is what I often tell people is the hardest part. As long as you get started and you start building pieces of it, here's where we get back to needing a framework to organize all the different pieces of your automation, and managing the process is really essential. So Deming always says, build quality in, and I always tell people we gotta be the shoemaker's children and make sure that we use these principles for ourselves. We have to do verification and validation on the very deployment framework that we're building. So we need a way to understand how to build, package, and deploy and organize all these different pieces. So it's an iterative process. You're not going to do this immediately straight out of the box. You got to make sure that we also have a feedback loop to tell us how we're doing. So a lot of what I want to talk about for the remainder of this presentation, and I think is just really important for folks to get their arms around, is the fact that you need a framework to help you organize it. And I call it, it's kind of the skeleton. We put all the parts on there, and it's also in some ways the conductor of the orchestra, so that you can run parts of it and see what parts have completed successfully. So, and understand what parts need to get rerun. So, do we need automation? Well, of course. I mean, sometimes developers, joke with me, real developers don't need to automate. We can do everything real fast. We just need smart people. And the one I like, this is the line that I always love, it's too complicated to automate, which is absolutely nonsense. So, once again, we got to get over that mindset. So let me bring in my colleague, Dean Leffingwell, who says, making each product a successful and routine event, an event that is indeed planned and eagerly anticipated, yet one that happens almost on autopilot. That's from his books, Agile Software Requirements, and Dean calls this the Agile Release Train, and I think that's just a great way to look at it. My colleagues Jez Humble and David Farley, they talk about the deployment pipeline as an automated implementation of your application's build, deploy, test, and release process. So we're seeing now, I'm not the only one that's saying we can make deployments easier. We gotta understand our practices, and the whole aim of the pipeline, according to these experts, is makes building, deploying, testing, releasing software visible. Hey, there's that transparency word again that's implicit in IT governance, software visible to everyone involved. It improves feedback so that problems are identified and so resolved. Hey, this is IT governance. Wow. So it's all part of the aim of the pipeline. And we enable teams to deploy and release any version of their software to any environment at will through a fully automated process. And this is from from their book, Continuous Deployment. So some of the anti-patterns that Jez mentions is deploying software manually, deploying a production-like environment only after the development is complete. So that means you should push things forward. You should always have deployment practices serving the developers, then QA, then UAT. Use the same practices in every environment. Don't just wait until the very end to try to automate things. You really got to start up front. And manual configuration of production environments are anti-patterns. These are things you should not do. They are practices that will contribute to failure and add to risk, as we talked about before. So another great practice is get your change control board going and make it a valued asset. The CCB can drive the entire release process. It's more than just gatekeeping, though. You want to make sure that you've got the right experts, those subject matter experts or SMEs, to help form the change advisory board. This is the group that tells the CCB what's going to happen if they make a certain change. So make sure you get yourself a CAB. That's the change advisory board. That's described in the ITIL framework, and we've written about that a great deal as well. And you want to make sure you're managing releases and updates and respond to variations as needed. You're going to have variations, and you want to make sure that you coordinate the whole process. So just some of the lessons learned that I have found to be most relevant. I mentioned before, look at release management and CM as the way that pilots look at the cockpit of an airplane. They make sure those controls are absolutely foolproof. People can't make mistakes. Automate everything, even a one-time command. Don't type it at the command line. Make a script, put a date and time on it, keep it in a script. This way you can go back and see exactly what you did. Traceability, repeatability, build quality in. We talked about that. Verification and validation. So these are some of my favorite lessons learned. So Agile CM is also a key area that a lot of folks are really putting a big focus on, and is very valuable. You want to be able to rapidly build, package, and deploy. You want to be able to support iterative development, deliver functionality to the end user, and maximize continuous integration with deployment to a test environment. So if you're using a CI server, you got cruise control, whatever product you have out there, some great continuous integration servers in the market. Make sure that you also deploy to an environment and actually run some tests against it. Testing is part of CM. So high rate of change. High rate of change can be challenging. It's a potential for significant pain. And once again, I wanted to quote someone else here. I wanted you to just hear my views. So Jez Humble says, if it hurts, do it more frequently and bring the pain forward. This sounds like my trainer when I was trying to learn how to lift weights. And I can lift all of 2 pounds now. So smaller iterative releases are really critical. They're much less risk. You get better at it. So if you go for a big bang release where you store everything up for a once-a-month release, frankly, that adds a lot of risk. If you get your release management process through a framework to a point where it's easy, then there's much less risk. You want to make releasing a non-event. That means it's something you know is going to happen and you're looking forward to it, but everybody knows that it's going to take a few hours and they're still going to get to enjoy their weekend. So it's easier to figure out what went wrong when you have smaller iterative releases as well. It's the same concept in continuous integration. So one key aspect of this is looking at the whole application lifecycle, or what we call the ALM. The ALM is a wide focus, tools are center stage, and the integration, what we call tool chains, is essential. And you automate in a workflow solutions. You actually have that traceability to make sure people are following the process. Now this should sound a little familiar because once again in IT governance, you want to make sure you have visibility into whether or not everybody followed the process. So automated processes, they're much easier to test. You have that traceability. Did I make a mistake? I always tell people, I make a lot of mistakes. I make tons of mistakes. I make more mistakes than anybody. But I can always show you exactly what I did, and that makes it much easier to go back, fix it in the automation, and then we don't make that same mistake again. And we also can see exactly what we did from one point to another. If you're doing things manually at the command line, you really are not going to accurately remember how you did the deployment last month. So this gets really tricky when you have complex environments. What version of Java are you using? What are your operating system patches? Which port's open? This stuff can get pretty hard to handle manually. So one concept that has come out in the deployment framework is to have my agent handle that. In other words, you have an agent that's running on a PC, another one that's running on your AIX box, another one that's running on your Linux box. So the front end of the deploy through the deployment framework is automated in a consistent way, and this back-end agent handles the platform-specific issues. And that makes it much easier to set up these deployment frameworks. It helps you with scalability, because this way you can also do 1,000 PCs at the same time. So agents, that's software that's running on the target machine that helps you with the deploy, is also one of the best practices that you'll find in some of the tools that are out there. And not surprisingly, by our sponsor, Nolio, they have this type of technology as well, and allows you to do parallel deploys and understand the status of every step of the deployment, and to be able to stop and restart as needed. So, just coming up on our conclusion, we're going to get to take some questions next, and of course, my colleague Francesca is going to come back and ask us some of the questions. But just in conclusion, IT governance and compliance is essential. We shouldn't think of it as being an afterthought. Having the transparency to know what's going on in the organization, the number of releases that are being completed, the number that failed. We talked about some of those metrics. providing that governance to senior management is really important to enable them to make the right decisions. And believe it or not, I've had senior managers that have said to me, okay, now that I see what's going on, I think you need more staff. I'm willing to give you some budget. So there's things that senior management can do for us if we give them the real data through IT governance. Compliance in many organizations not optional. That is, playing by those regulatory requirements. If you're a bank or other financial services firm or medical or defense, you've got serious regulatory requirements and they are not optional. So you want to make sure that you are considering what the impact of IT governance and compliance is on your organization. And I always tell people this should not just be an opportunity where you pass an audit. We have an opportunity here rather to enhance quality and productivity. You have all these processes open. You're looking at all your tools. You're looking at how you do build, package, and deploy. Why not make it worth your while and help yourself get from 2 days down to a couple of hours to do a deploy? I have literally seen deployments go from a week down to an hour using and that's dramatic. I mean, sometimes you only get from a few days down to a half a day. Fine, I'll take it. But the point is, you can enhance both your quality because you don't make so many mistakes, you get it right, and also your productivity. And one thing that's really key here is you make this easy, you can take more releases. That helps your developers a lot, because if they can give you bug fixes in smaller increments, there's much less risk of there being a problem as a result. It makes it much easier to manage that. So I really want to focus on the fact you got to have a framework. You can't do this in bits and pieces. You need something to help you really organize your thoughts and the processes, and you can't do this all at once. It's an iterative process. You make a small change just to get started, and that will really help you address the first issues, and then you can take it from there. And making an iterative process means you can show some good results, and then over time get a little better at each point. Now, I can't go further without mentioning that Nolio is our sponsor for this. They've got a great deployment framework, and we're going to be putting up their contact information in just a moment, so you can take a look at that. But I really want to come back to Francesca and see if she's got some questions for us, and I bet she does.
That's right, Bob. But first, I want to thank you for that great presentation that you and Leslie gave. And I want to remind our audience members, if you have any questions for Bob or Leslie, please type them into the chat box located just to the right of the screen, and we'll get through as many as we can with the time we've got left. So with that being said, our first question, this is a great one from our audience. My management doesn't really support setting up these practices, so how do I get started without top-down support? Excuse me.
Well, honestly, that's a tough question. And frankly, that's a good example of a risk. Because if your senior management does not support what you're doing, the chances of you being successful are slim indeed. And so what you may need to do to get started is really market, really put on your sales hat and sell your senior management on supporting this effort. Now that said, I've been in lots of organizations where the real change came from the bottom up. And it was the developers who said, hey, this isn't the right source code management solution for us. Let's evaluate the products that are out there and start using something else that can help us do our work better. And sometimes, frankly, that's it's the folks in the trenches that really understand which way to point their rifles and do the right thing. But I gotta say, at the end of the day, having senior management support is, as far as I'm concerned, it's just an absolute requirement. So what I always say to people is that it's important to go from both the top down and the bottom up. Francesca, what do you think?
I agree with that. Yeah, okay. All right. And Leslie, do you want to add to that?
All right. Cool.
Well, I just wanted to highlight what Bob was saying about going from the bottom down, because the same way that you want to make a sales pitch and have the upper management be on your team, the fact is that the, quote, little people, or the people doing the actual work, know better than anybody what works and what doesn't. And if you can convince them that this is going to help them and make them better at what they do, and they're going to come out both more productive and feeling comfortable with their work and being able to present a better product to their upper management, they're going to come on board, and that's going to make your job of showing the upper management why this is so valuable even easier. So, you know, it certainly is important if you're getting flack from the bottom to have the upper pushing, but the fact is the real work is being done at a certain level, and if you get those people on board with the project, it filters up just as fast.
Okay.
All right.
Given that, how do you overcome resistance to change?
Oh, boy. You know, I was at one place, Francesca, where the manager brought me over, literally brought me over a stick. And I remember it was a small hockey stick, and he said, look, you know, keep this by your desk and make sure people know that you're allowed to use it. And he was being facetious, of course, but frankly, you know, I've been in places, and you know, I hate to, you know, rat out some of the government agencies are the worst for this, where you see people in all the meetings with their arms crossed across the chest, and you know, they don't want anything being done differently. They've been there for 20 years, and you're coming in, and what are you trying to tell them how to do releases faster for? And you know, meanwhile, you know, they can't make a one-line change in production without blowing their systems up. So, frankly, overcoming resistance to change can be really difficult. And, you know, this is something that's we took a whole chapter to talk about this in our book. I think for me, one of the aha experiences was really learning to market what I was doing and really, you know, become a salesperson. And I'm going to ask you know, Leslie to come in and give her input on this too. But, you know, I think there's a people side of this, and maybe Leslie can speak more to the people side. I've often had, you know, some trouble with that. What do you think, Francesca? Can we get Leslie in on this one?
Of course. Leslie, what do you think?
Absolutely. I had some things I wanted to add. Two things came to mind right away. One is the old adage that you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, and that works here too. If you're going to just on a personal level make people comfortable, they're going to open their ears and their mind to what you have to say more than if you try to bully them. And the other thing is an important lesson that I learned from my father, who our book is actually dedicated to, and he always taught us that any good business interaction has to be win-win. He would not have approved of, you know, some of the political statements where they pit business against individuals and vice versa, because he really felt that good business is everybody has to win something, and that's the key to negotiating. And so in terms of resistance, what you want to be doing is showing all of the players how there's something in it for each of them. It's not you coming in and imposing another system that's more work for them. It's you giving them tools for their job to become easier. And that naturally is going to break down the resistance. The other piece of it that's a personality/psychology aspect to resistance is that you have to, you know, sort of have a little insight into the fact that there are different types of people, and you try to have some way for each of the different personality types to have a role in the team and the process that suits them, because you're going to get a lot less resistance if you're working with their natural tendency than if you're fighting with them. And it's not as hard as it sounds. If you look in our book, you'll see there are specific examples, but that's the key principles, that you want to kind of get a feel for each of the people and find a way to involve them in the process that suits their natural way of processing.
Okay, excellent
Back
advice.
to you guys.
Those are all good points.
Yes, excellent advice, and Wise words of wisdom. Now, next question, why is it essential and or advisable to have a different resource do the builds?
I'm going to take this one.
Okay, so I'm going to...
You know...
We can share the floor.
Leslie, you go first. Go ahead, Leslie. You can go first.
Okay. No, I just wanted to point out, because we kind of skipped over it before with the separation of duties, that one thing that I've noticed is that in addition to the fact that some people don't want to acknowledge when they've made a mistake, sometimes they just don't see it. And anybody who's done editing knows this. It's much easier to edit somebody else's writing than your own, because besides the psychological reluctance to pick up on your own errors, you just sometimes don't notice them because your brain will fill in for them. And having another set of eyes is just so useful, and so you always want to have a different entity involved with the build and the release versus the developers. Bob?
Yeah, I can just tell you from my own experience, I've often been this independent build person, and the first time I try to build, it always fails. And it fails usually because I'm not telepathic. And the developers thought that I automatically knew to set environment variable squivel squivel to XYZ pound slash C colon backslash. And I'm like, well, I love surprises, guys, but you know, in configuration management, it's good to know how to set those environment variables, and usually it's because they forget to put it in the release notes, they forget to communicate it, because they did it 3 months ago, they set it on their machine, and they didn't think about it again. So having an independent person rebuild the release on a different computer using a different computer account, the first time it always fails. It's not a bad thing. You find out what are those things that I forgot to check into source code management. What are those dependencies that I forgot to get my arms around? Talk about risk. You know, I was working with a team doing a trading system not too long ago. They lost the Ant script to do their build. And they were building Java classes on the side and just sort of hacking them in to the jar and deploying that jar into production. Yikes! So they knew they couldn't rebuild the release. They knew they couldn't find their code. So they just sort of like, you know, and it's a trading system. It's not the kind of thing you want to, you know, really cut corners on. So, you know, Francesca, I know we got just a couple more minutes, but you know, I think this is a real good thing that you know, to make sure people understand. We're not saying that anybody is not smart. They're not doing a great job. You know, we're putting in these extra steps to test ourselves, to verify that we've got all the right things there. And, you know, I got to tell you, one instance, there's someone asked me this question: what if my loved one, I was asked this on a job interview one time, what if my loved one was on a life support system and I did the release management for it? What would I do to make sure that I never made a mistake that, God forbid, could jeopardize the life of my loved one? And, you know, when you look at things from the perspective of how do I make absolutely certain that I can't make a mistake, you know, then I think these practices start to make a whole lot more sense. Trust but verify. Francesca, back to you.
All right, so we've got time for 1 or 2 more questions, so let's get right to it. Quickly, do you have any recommended best SCM processes for cloud computing?
Wow, that's a great question, and this is something I would sure love to interact directly with the person who asked this question and anybody else who is interested in this topic. This is something that is really, really hot right now, and I don't have all the answers right now, but I sure do. Yeah, I think that this is, you know, real finger on the pulse time. So I've recently become very involved with some cloud computing efforts, and one of the things that I noticed is the risks are far greater when you don't have control over everything And very often people don't have as many practices in place because they're saying to themselves, hey, the vendor's managing it. And actually, you need these practices in place more because things are being done on the side that you don't have control over. So the first thing is, with cloud computing, you want to make sure that you really consider all of the platform dependencies, all the change control dependencies, what's the vendor SLA. There's a lot more, and I think that this is something I'm going to ask the person. I think I'm going to try to reach out to them directly, and maybe this is something we could get into a whole article or perhaps another webinar and really address it in more detail. Back to you, Francesca.
Well, that's excellent. So we'll give you that person's contact information. And the final question, what are some of the lessons learned from implementing all these practices that you've spoken about today?
Well, I got to tell you, I've made every mistake you can make in the. I had a whole chapter in my book on mistakes that I've made, not because I feel guilty about them, but because it's really important to take a look at what these lessons learned are. And some of the things that I've learned is to provide that transparency to the whole organization as to what you're doing, and that's implicit in what IT governance is all about. Make sure that you really use industry best practices and not just try to reinvent the wheel. And that's, those are the standards and frameworks that we should all be consulting. And I'm going to, really put it on the line here. I got a lot of colleagues out there that haven't read the materials from ISACA. They haven't read the materials from ITIL. They haven't read the IEEE standards, the EIA, and I'm asking them, how can you consider yourself to be a professional if you haven't looked at all the best practices that are out there? So that is really critical, is, looking at what other people have done and what their suggestions are, and even if you disagree, that's fine, but making sure that you're open. And, that's a mistake that I made early on. It's a mistake that I certainly won't make again. And I think that implicit in developing a robust deployment framework is really making sure that you look at what the other experts have to say, and those are the sorts of lessons that I've certainly learned the hard way, and I hope from sharing with you in this webinar that you won't make the same mistakes.
Well said, well said. Leslie, really quick, before we end this event today, do you want to add anything to that or any final thoughts?
Just to reiterate that as much as there's a technology piece of it, which is so important, ultimately there are people driving the technology. So you have to remember that, treat them like people, get them on board, help them understand, cut through the intellectual and cognitive hurdles that they have, but remember that, good job always goes far. Saying thank you is important.
And Bob, do you have any final notes or comments?
Just that, this is a team sport. I hope everybody will reach out to us on CM Crossroads and the Agile Journal, and we'd love to continue all of these conversations online and share our best practices. I often tell people, I know a lot about this stuff, not because I'm particularly smart, but because I've, gotten out there and shared my ideas. I hope you all will do the same and come out and interact with us in our virtual community, where you get everybody sharing what works and different ways of doing things a whole lot better. That's it for me, Francesca. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to both, to you, Bob and Leslie. And we're out of time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please join us for our next Agile Journal Business Webcast Series broadcast taking place on July 19th, which is sponsored by CollabNet. And again, a big thank you to everyone involved and also to everyone who attended today. Have a wonderful day.